February 14th, 1929. Chicago. 7 men entered a garage on North Clark Street. Only one walked out alive, and he'd die hours later. The man believed to be behind it. He had the perfect alibi, sitting in a Miami courthouse 1,000 miles away. His name was Al Capone, and in just 7 years, he'd gone from Brooklyn street kid to controlling a criminal empire worth over $100 million. That's $1.4 billion in today's money. But here's what the history books don't tell you. How a barber's son with a third-grade education outsmarted politicians, outgunned rivals, and ultimately got taken down by something nobody expected. This is the untold story of America's most infamous gangster, and the shocking way it all fell apart. Let's go back to where it started. Brooklyn, New York, 1899. The Capone family lived in a cramped tenement apartment in a neighborhood overflowing with immigrants chasing the American dream. Gabriel Capone worked as a barber. His wife Teresa was a seamstress. They weren't criminals, they were hardworking people trying to survive. Their son Alphonse was born into a world where legitimate work meant poverty, while men in expensive suits seemed to control everything. Young Al watched the hierarchy of the streets, Irish gangs, Jewish bookmakers, and Italian organizations that operated with impunity. At age 14, Al left school after a confrontation with a teacher. Historical records show he never returned to formal education. Instead, he began working odd jobs in his neighborhood, eventually connecting with the 5 Points Gang, one of Manhattan's most powerful criminal organizations. It was here that Al met Johnny Torrio, a sophisticated organized crime figure who would become his mentor. According to FBI records, Torrio taught young Capone the fundamentals of criminal enterprise, organization, political connections, and calculated violence when necessary. The teenage Capone was learning a dark curriculum, one that would shape the future of organized crime in America. By 18, he was working at the Harvard Inn in Brooklyn, a legitimate business with illegitimate backroom operations. 1917. 20-year-old Al worked as a bartender and bouncer at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island. According to multiple historical accounts, an incident occurred that would literally mark him for life. The details vary depending on the source, but the documented outcome is clear. Al Capone received 3 significant facial scars from a knife attack. The exact circumstances have been disputed by historians, but the result was undeniable: prominent scars on his left cheek and jaw that newspapers would later use to create his nickname, Scarface. According to crime historians, Capone refused to identify his attacker to authorities, a decision that earned him respect within criminal circles. This adherence to the code of silence, or omerta, would define his reputation. That same year brought a different kind of change. Al married Mee Coughlin, an Irish-American woman who, according to biographical records, remained devoted to him for the rest of his life. 3 weeks after their marriage, she gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Capone, known as Sonny. Capone was now a husband and father, roles that, according to those who knew him, he took seriously despite his criminal activities. The scars made him recognizable. Fatherhood made him ambitious. Both would drive what came next. January 16, 1920. The 18th Amendment took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol in the United States. Prohibition, intended to reduce crime and improve public health, instead created the largest black market in American history. Johnny Torrio, now operating in Chicago, recognized the unprecedented opportunity. He contacted his former protege with an offer: come to Chicago and help build an organization to capitalize on America's new illegal alcohol economy. In 1919, according to documented records, Al Capone moved his family to Chicago. He was 20 years old with limited legitimate employment prospects and a criminal record from New York. Chicago in 1920 was fractured among ethnic criminal organizations. Irish gangs controlled the North Side, Italian groups dominated the South Side, and various other factions competed for territory. Torrio established Capone as a manager at the Four Deuces, a South Side establishment that served as a front for bootlegging coordination. Historical records indicate Capone excelled at the role. He demonstrated aptitude for negotiation, organization, and when necessary, enforcement. He cultivated relationships with police officers, politicians, and judges, the foundation of what crime historians call systemic corruption. Notably, Capone also engaged in highly publicized charitable activities. During economic hardship, he funded soup kitchens that fed thousands. Newspapers documented these efforts extensively, creating a complex public image: violent criminal and community benefactor. Chicago was becoming Capone's city, but it wouldn't come without a price. May 11, 1920. Big Jim Colosimo, Torrio's boss and a powerful Chicago crime figure, was killed in his own restaurant. The murder was never officially solved, though crime historians widely believe it was orchestrated by Torrio with possible involvement from Capone. Colosimo had reportedly refused to expand into bootlegging, a decision that made him expendable in the new economy. With Colosimo gone, Torrio took control. Al Capone became his second in command. Over the next 4 years, according to federal investigations, they built a sophisticated criminal network. The operation included breweries, distribution routes, speakeasies, and extensive political protection. Federal estimates later valued the enterprise at approximately $100 million annually. But Chicago's North Side Irish gang, led by Dean O'Banion, refused to cooperate. O'Banion controlled valuable territory and had no interest in Torrio's organization. On November 10, 1924, O'Banion was killed in his flower shop. Multiple shooters entered the establishment and, according to police reports, fired multiple rounds. O'Banion died at the scene. His second-in-command, George Bugs Morin, vowed retaliation. The fragile peace was over. On January 24, 1925, gunmen ambushed Johnny Torrio outside his apartment. He survived being shot multiple times, but, according to documented accounts, decided to retire from criminal leadership. From his hospital bed, Torrio reportedly turned over control to Al Capone. At 26 years old, Capone was now Chicago's most powerful crime boss. Think about that for a second. 26 years old, and he's running a $100 million criminal empire. If this story is keeping you hooked, hit that like button and drop a comment. What do you think drove someone so young to seek that much power? Between 1925 and 1929, Al Capone operated what federal investigators later described as one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. He established headquarters at the Lexington Hotel, converting entire floors into fortified spaces with security personnel and reinforced structures. According to those who worked with him, he rarely spent consecutive nights in the same location. Capone's public persona was carefully cultivated. He wore expensive custom clothing, drove an armored vehicle, and presented himself as a businessman. In media interviews, he famously stated he was simply supplying a public demand and called his operations the legitimate beer business. Behind this facade, federal records document a different reality: violence against competitors, systematic intimidation, and coordination of illegal activities across multiple states. One documented incident involves Joe Howard, who, according to witnesses, disrespected one of Capone's associates. Howard was later found deceased from gunshot wounds. Despite occurring in a public location with witnesses, no one provided testimony to authorities, a pattern that repeated throughout Capone's tenure. Simultaneously, Capone maintained his charitable activities. During the early Depression years, his soup kitchens reportedly served over 2,000 meals daily. He made donations to various causes and cultivated relationships with celebrities, athletes, and politicians. This duality, violent criminal and public benefactor, made him a fascinating and troubling figure in American culture. By 1928, Capone's organization controlled most of Chicago's illegal alcohol trade, but absolute power was creating dangerous tensions. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. At approximately 10:30 a.m., several men entered a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. According to police reports, members of Bugs Moran's organization were inside, awaiting a shipment. What happened next became one of the most notorious incidents in American crime history. According to witness accounts and police investigation, men dressed as police officers entered the garage. Moran's associates, believing it was a routine police raid, reportedly complied with orders to line up against the wall. Then, according to police reports, the attackers opened fire with Thompson's submachine guns. 7 men were killed. The only survivor, Frank Gusenberg, reportedly refused to identify the shooters before succumbing to his injuries. The massacre made international headlines. Public outcry was immediate and intense. President Herbert Hoover reportedly called for federal action against Chicago's criminal organizations. Al Capone was in Miami at the time, a verifiable fact documented by court records, as he was meeting with prosecutors regarding an unrelated case. He had what investigators called an ironclad alibi. When questioned by reporters, Capone expressed shock and denied any involvement. No charges were ever filed directly connecting him to the massacre, though historians and investigators widely believe he ordered it. Bugs Moran, who arrived late and escaped, reportedly told police, "Only Capone kills like that." The massacre effectively ended the gang war. Capone's organization dominated, but the public attention would prove catastrophic. The St. Valentine's Day massacre created political pressure that couldn't be ignored. President Hoover reportedly demanded, "Get Capone." The problem was endemic corruption. Most Chicago law enforcement was either paid off or intimidated. Conventional prosecution seemed impossible. The Treasury Department took 2 approaches. First, Prohibition agent Elliot Ness assembled a team of agents specifically chosen for their integrity. They conducted raids on Capone's breweries and transportation operations, destroying equipment and disrupting distribution. Newspapers dubbed them the Untouchables because they refused bribes. While these operations damaged Capone's business, they didn't provide prosecutable charges. Second, and more significantly, IRS investigator Frank Wilson pursued a different strategy: tax evasion. Wilson's investigation was meticulous. He analyzed financial records, tracked purchases, documented expenditures. Federal records show Capone spent enormous sums on luxury goods, custom clothing, jewelry, property, while reporting minimal to no income on tax returns. The evidence was compelling. Capone either had to admit the income came from illegal sources or admit he failed to pay taxes on legitimate income. Either way, he faced criminal charges. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion. The empire that survived gang wars and police raids was about to fall to an accountant with a calculator. October 1931. United States v. Al Capone began in Chicago's federal courthouse. According to documented accounts, Capone initially appeared confident. Reports suggest he believed he'd secured favorable treatment through jury tampering. Then Judge James Wilkerson made an unexpected decision. He switched juries with another courtroom immediately before proceedings began. The jury Capone allegedly influenced was replaced with one that had no prior connection to the case. The prosecution presented extensive evidence: receipts showing substantial personal expenditures, testimony from merchants who'd sold him luxury goods, financial records documenting his lavish lifestyle, all while he reported minimal taxable income. The defense struggled to explain the discrepancy. How could someone spend hundreds of thousands of dollars while earning almost nothing? After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 5 counts. Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison, at the time, the harshest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion. He was also fined $50,000 and ordered to pay $30,000 in court costs. Capone was present for the sentencing. Their son Sonny, who had lost his hearing due to childhood illness, watched as his father was taken into federal custody. The man who'd built a $100 million criminal empire was convicted not of murder or bootlegging, but of failing to pay his taxes. Al Capone initially served time at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, but reports of continued influence from inside prison prompted a transfer. In August 1934, Capone was among the first prisoners sent to Alcatraz, the newly opened maximum security facility on an island in San Francisco Bay. At Alcatraz, he was prisoner 85. The facility was designed to house America's most dangerous criminals with no special privileges. Capone worked in the prison laundry and was subject to the same regulations as every other prisoner. But something was changing. Prison medical records, later released publicly, document increasingly erratic behavior. He experienced mood swings, confusion, and deteriorating cognitive function. Prison physicians diagnosed neurosyphilis, a late-stage manifestation of untreated syphilis that affects the brain and nervous system. Medical historians believe Capone likely contracted the disease years earlier and never received adequate treatment. By the mid-1930s, it was causing significant neurological damage. By 1938, Capone petitioned for early release on medical grounds. Independent medical evaluations confirmed severe cognitive impairment. On November 16, 1939, after serving 7 years and 6 months, Al Capone was released from federal custody. He was 40 years old. The man who once controlled Chicago now struggled with basic cognitive tasks. He retreated to his Palm Island estate in Florida with me and Sonny, living in increasing isolation as his condition worsened. Al Capone spent his final years at his Florida estate, largely withdrawn from public life. Medical records indicate progressive deterioration from neurosyphilis, affecting both his physical and mental capabilities. According to family accounts and medical documentation, his condition caused significant cognitive impairment. He required constant care from me and medical professionals. The empire was gone. Prohibition had ended in 1933, eliminating the black market that funded his organization. His associates had moved on or been prosecuted. The Chicago he once dominated had changed completely. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. He briefly regained consciousness, but developed complications including cardiac arrest and pneumonia. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947, at 7:25 p.m., surrounded by family members. He was 48 years old. His funeral was attended primarily by family. The newspapers ran brief obituaries noting the death of the former crime boss. The FBI closed its file with a simple notation. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in the family plot. The gravestone bears his legal name and dates: Alphonse Capone, 1890-1947. And that's how it ended, not in a shootout or a dramatic escape, but in a quiet room with family, his mind destroyed by a disease he never treated. So what's the real story of Al Capone? The historical record shows a complex figure, a violent criminal who funded soup kitchens, a devoted family man who ordered killings, a ruthless businessman who died broke and confused. According to FBI estimates, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was never officially solved. The millions generated by his organization were never fully recovered. Many of his crimes were never prosecuted. But Capone's impact on organized crime is undeniable. Crime historians note that he demonstrated how criminal enterprises could operate as businesses, with hierarchies, territories, and corporate-style management. Subsequent organized crime figures studied his methods, what worked, and crucially, what led to his downfall. The Chicago he controlled is history. Prohibition ended, the speakeasies closed, the corruption networks were dismantled. but the legend persists. If you made it to the end of this story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button because we've got more incredible true crime stories from history coming your way. And here's a question for the comments. Do you think Capone was a product of Prohibition, or would he have become a criminal mastermind in any era? I genuinely want to know what you think. Comment below. Also, if you want to see how other famous criminals fell from power, check out the video we've linked in the description. The name Al Capone still resonates nearly 80 years after his death. He represents a specific moment in American history when federal prohibition created a criminal empire, when one individual could control major city through a combination of violence, corruption, and public relations. He was America's most infamous gangster, and this was his documented story.